Welcome back. In this episode, you're going to learn how to accept a one-time payment using a custom form with the payment element. If you're looking for a simpler integration path, we have the no-code payment links option where you can set up a payment link directly through the dashboard and then share that with your customers through social media, email, text message, etc. Alternatively, there's another option called Stripe Checkout. This is a very simple integration that has one API call on the server. You redirect your customer to a Stripe hosted page. But in today's episode, we're going to talk about integrating the payment element. This allows you to build your own custom hosted form and collect lots of different payment method types. So the payment element supports anything from cards all the way to bank accounts. You've got support for wallets like Google Pay and Apple Pay, all the way to buy now, pay later like Affirm and Afterpay, ClearPay. So it is a great option for building your own custom form to accept a one-time payment. So just as a quick roadmap for today, we're going to install a sample, then we're going to go through the dashboard and talk about how you can enable payment methods. These are going to be those payment methods that are dynamically rendered into the payment element every time the page loads. And then we're going to create a payment intent on the server and use its client secret to render the payment element on the client so that we can collect payment details from the customer. We'll ultimately submit that payment to Stripe. And then we're going to handle any of those post-processing events. We're going to talk about webhooks and a few other considerations that you might want to think about as you're building out your integration. So let's get into it. We're going to jump into Visual Studio Code and use the Stripe for VS Code extension. You can go to the extensions gallery for VS Code and install this extension yourself. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this start with a Stripe sample today so that we don't have to write all the boilerplate. And we're going to search for the starter sample. We're going to use the main integration and an HTML front end with a Python backend. We'll name this starter Python. And this is going to just allow us to clone a sample down into our local machine, and we'll use this as a template for what we're going to build today. So we're going to open this in the same exact window. So let's take a quick look at what comes when we install this starter. We have a client directory and a server directory. In the client, there is a simple index.html file and a little bit of CSS. In the server directory, we have a .env. This is going to have our API keys. If you've already logged in with the Stripe CLI, this should be pre-populated with some API keys from your account. If not, you can head over to the Stripe dashboard under the developers section. You can grab your API keys and drop those here in a .env. And finally, we're going to take a look at this server file. So in the server, we are installing a couple of dependencies. We have a couple of routes that are already predefined for us, one for fetching the root, and that's going to render that index.html page from the client directory. We also have this /config for fetching publishable keys. And we're going to re-implement this create payment intent route so that we can talk about how we're going to go about creating payment intents. And finally, there is a skeleton here for a webhook handler that will allow you to start experimenting with automations around different events that are firing on your Stripe account. So the first thing we want to do is open up the terminal here, and we're going to create a new virtual environment. So we're going to say Python 3-m venv, and we're going to just activate this. Venv bin activate. Then from the server directory, I'm going to pip install -r the requirements.txt. This is going to install the dependencies. Now I can say Python server and fire up this server, and we can take a look at what we've already got out of the box. So we'll refresh localhost :4242, and this is the base sample. So let's get into it. Now from the Stripe dashboard, we can head over to the settings and to the payment method settings. This is where we can manage our payment methods and enable or disable different ways that customers can pay through our payment element. So you'll see here that we have cards enabled, Link, Apple Pay, Google Pay, several different wallet methods. There's lots of different bank redirects. These are popular across Europe. We also have some buy now, pay later payment methods that are enabled. Finally, we even have ACH direct debit as one of the payment methods that customers could use. Now, if we wanted to enable Canadian pre-authorized debits, we could click turn on, and this would enable us to use Canadian pre-authorized debits as a payment method type inside of our payment flows. So this is where we manage our payment methods. And these are the payment methods that will be dynamically derived inside of our payment element when we render that and show it to customers. So that's how you enable and manage your payment methods. Instead of needing to deploy any new code, you can just come into the dashboard and enable or disable different payment method types. Here's a high-level overview of what we'll implement today. When the customer lands on our page, we're going to make an AJAX request back to our server, and that might include any information about the product that they're about to purchase or the service that they're about to buy. And on the server, we're going to make an API call to Stripe to create a payment intent. Then we're going to return that payment intent's client secret back to the client so that we can render the payment element. Let's get into this step here where we're going to make the API call to Stripe to create the payment intent and return its client secret back. Let's create a new route on the server, app.route, and this is going to be to create payment intent. And the methods we're going to support are post, and we'll just call this method create payment intent. Now, if we're using the Stripe for VS Code extension, we can say Stripe payment intent create and hit tab, and this will autocomplete the API call that we need to use when we're creating this payment intent. Now, the amount here is going to be in the smallest denomination of the currency. So in this case, if we're talking about USD, this is $20, so 2,000 cents. So let's actually make this $10.99. Now, you could technically derive this amount based on something that was passed in. You don't want to pass the amount from the front end and use that here. Instead, what you could do is pass down some product ID, and then maybe you like look up the product in the database and calculate the amount. But you don't want to actually pass this in from the front end because that would enable end users or potentially malicious users to modify the HTML to their own custom amount and pass that down. Here you can specify different currencies. Here we might change this to euros. And instead of hard coding a list of payment method types here, we can pass automatic payment methods enabled true. And this will allow us to derive those payment methods from the Stripe dashboard. Now, this API call is going to return a payment intent, and we want to use that payment intent's client secret in our response. We're going to return JSONify of client secret is going to be payment intent.client secret. Okay, let's see if this is working. So we'll make sure that we restart our server. And let's create a new shell here where we're going to test out that endpoint by saying curl-x post to localhost 4242/create payment intent. Now, you could use a tool like Postman or Insomnia or some other REST client to experiment with this new server endpoint. Here, we're just using curl to send a raw post request to that endpoint, and we get back the JSON totally as expected. So this is what a client secret looks like. This is what we need to pass back to the front end in order to render that payment element. So let's do that next. So let's open up index.html and take a look at the sample that we have already. So we're going to change this to accept a payment. We need to add a form where we're going to collect payment details. We'll call this the payment form. And inside of here, we're going to add a div. And that div is going to be the container for the payment element. We're also going to add a button, and this button is just going to say pay. And finally, we'll also add another div here for displaying any error messages. Okay, so this is a good start. We also want to write a little bit of JavaScript that is going to handle mounting the payment element and displaying that payment element. Notice that we are loading Stripe.js from js.stripe.com here on every single page. We're going to also add another script tag here that's going to allow us to load payment.js so that we can write a little bit of JavaScript for interacting with our form today. So let's make a new file. We're going to save this as payment.js in the client directory. Now, when the DOM is fully loaded, we're going to fetch the publishable key and initialize Stripe. Then we're going to fetch the client secret and initialize elements. Okay, so we're going to use the fetch API here to hit that /config route. That's going to return a promise that will resolve with a response object. And that response object has a JSON method on it that we want to call. And again, we're going to wait for that to give us back the JSON that was returned from the server. That'll allow us to have this publishable key that we need to initialize Stripe. So we can say Stripe is going to be this new instance of Stripe, and we're going to pass in that publishable key. Okay, now we need to fetch the client secret. So we're going to again use the fetch API, but this time we're going to call create payment intent. That's the endpoint. And because it's a post request, we need to pass this options block to fetch so that we can specify the method as post and maybe some headers. And these headers might have a content type of application JSON. And this is also where you might pass back a request body that would include information like the product or the cart or some information that you can use on the server to derive the amount that you want to ultimately charge. This is again going to return a response object. So we're going to wait for that to come back, and then we're going to wait for its JSON. And this will also return a promise that we're going to wait for and grab off that client secret property that we're going to use to initialize elements. So we're going to say const elements is stripe.elements. And typically in older Stripe integrations, you would just call stripe.elements like this, and it would give you back an elements group that you could then use to render a card element or a single element for collecting bank account details. But what we're going to do today is we're actually going to pass in an argument to elements here for the client secret. That client secret property is going to be used to derive which payment methods should be displayed on the payment element. So now we're going to create a payment element by saying elements.create payment. And then we can say payment element.mount. And we're going to pass in the CSS selector for that div that we created in index.html. So this payment element CSS selector matches the CSS selector that we're passing into mount. All right, let's take this for a spin. And when we refresh our page here, we can see that the payment element is rendered out. Notice that if we go back to the server and we change the currency from euros to USD and save that, when we refresh the page, the payment methods that are available change to those that support USD. So now we can pay with a US bank account or Klarna. Next, we need to submit these payment details to Stripe. So we're going to grab reference to the form by saying document.getElementById for the payment form. And on submission of that form, we're going to prevent the default action from the event that was given to us so that the form is not submitted so that we can handle some of this client side. Then we're going to call a method from Stripe.js called stripe.confirmPayment. Now this new method accepts in an options block. One of the required arguments is the elements group. So we're going to pass in reference to that elements group that we used earlier. Another is some confirm params. And at a minimum, this is going to require a return URL. This is where the customer is going to be redirected after they go through this payment flow. So here we can just say window.location.href.split. We'll split on the question mark in case there's a query string, and we'll grab the first reference of that. We're just going to add complete.html to the end. We're going to add a new page for that completion in just a minute. So this confirm payment method is going to actually return a promise, and that promise might resolve with an error property. That's in case something failed as part of trying to submit those details to Stripe. If that happens, we want to handle the error and populate that error messages div with the content of the error message. So we're going to say messages is document.getElementById, error messages. Messages.inner text is going to be error.message. Typically, this confirm payment is actually going to redirect us back to this complete route. If you don't want to redirect, there are options that you can pass in so that it will only redirect for payment methods that require redirection. Otherwise, this is the default action, is it's going to redirect to this complete page after it successfully collects payment. Each payment method is going to behave just a little bit differently, so you'll want to go through and test each one of them, and we'll talk about how to test in a little bit. Okay, now that we are handling the form submission, we can go through this process once more, refresh the page, enter in a test card. This is the 4242 test card, very popular card, and we're going to click on pay. You'll notice that we are redirected to a new route /complete.html that's not found, but one thing that I wanted to point out is that in the query string param, we have the ID of the payment intent And we also have the client secret property for the payment intent that we can use to retrieve the payment intent and display content about what was just purchased on this completion page. All right, let's create complete.html. So we're going to create a new file here called complete.html. And this is going to look somewhat similar to our index.html. So I'm just going to grab a lot of that context there. And then we'll just close out some of these divs, and we'll close out the body, and we'll close out the HTML. And we should be looking pretty good here. Okay, instead of payment.js, we're going to call this complete.js. And we're also going to create a new one of those. So we're going to call this complete.js. Again, we want to wait till the DOM is loaded. And when the DOM is loaded, we're again going to fetch the publishable key and initialize an instance of Stripe. Now let's extract that payment intent client secret from the query string params. We're going to create a new URL search params object and pass in window.location.href. And we're going to be able to pull out the client secret from params.get payment intent client secret. Now we can use that client secret to retrieve the payment intent. So on Stripe.js, there is a method called retrieve payment intent, and it takes in that client secret property. This will return a promise that will resolve with an object that might have a payment intent on it. All right, let's render out the content of this payment intent. We're just going to render its JSON into a pre-tag. So let's drop a pre-tag into the HTML, and then we're going to grab reference to that pre-tag here. So we'll say payment intent pre is document.get element by ID payment intent, and then we're going to say payment intent pre-tag inner text is going to be equal to JSON.stringify of the payment intent, and we'll pass null to just so that it looks nice. So if we refresh the page here, this is the JSON content for the payment intent. So you could imagine displaying the amount that was charged and the status of that payment. If you wanted, you could also expand the payment method and show some details about maybe the last 4 digits of the card that was used, etc. So this is how we might build a completion or a success page, letting the customer know that they have gone through the payment flow successfully. One important thing to note is you don't want to use this completion page, like the request for loading the completion page, as the signal for fulfillment. You don't want to actually like pull from inventory or ship things based on this page loading. Instead, you should use a webhook handler. That's because there's several different reasons that this page might not actually load. For instance, the customer's internet might go out, or there's, their machine might crash or whatever. So there's a possibility this page might not load, but payment will be successful. In which case you want to handle all fulfillment with your webhook handler. So let's jump back into server.py and talk about this for a moment. So webhooks are much more reliable because if webhooks are down for any reason, Stripe is going to retry delivery of those webhooks for up to 3 days with exponential backoff. So let's talk about this webhook handler, right? We are going to receive post requests directly from Stripe when events fire on our account. Another handy tool for the Stripe for VS Code extension is testing and building these integrations with webhooks. So we have this ability to forward events to a specific URL. So we can pick a localhost 4242/webhook as the account event URL. Account events are those events that are firing directly on your Stripe account. There's another URL. So if we hit enter here, this is the URL for connect events. So if you're building a connect platform where you're facilitating payments on behalf of other users or other merchants, then you would also want to enter a connect endpoint, potentially a different webhook endpoint. So we're going to hit enter. We're not actually using connect today. And now we are going to see some terminal output at the bottom, and that will include a webhook signing secret that we could use to verify that payloads are actually coming from Stripe. Now that we're forwarding events, anytime events fire on our Stripe account, those are going to be delivered directly to our local running server. We don't have to set up any tunneling software like ngrok. We don't have to host this in any public endpoint. By using the Stripe CLI and the Stripe for VS Code extension to forward events, we're able to have those events delivered directly to our machine. Let me show you what I'm talking about. If we navigate back to localhost 4242, When we load the page, recall that we're making that request to create a payment intent. And now we can see this event in our logs that a payment intent was created, and we have a 200 status code as the response from our webhook handler. So as events come in, we'll want to handle several different types. The one that we're handling right now is payment intent.succeeded. You might have a payment intent that is pending or a payment intent where payment fails. You'll want to make sure that you're handling all those different scenarios. Right now, we're just printing out that we received payment. So if we were to go back through this payment flow one more time and click on pay, we'll see that the event is delivered to our webhook handler. So we see this payment intent succeeded. And if we look at the server logs, we'll see this payment received log that was printed out into the console. So this is how we're going to handle webhook events. Now, in production, you will not use the Stripe CLI or the Stripe for VS Code extension to forward those events. Instead, you'll have a publicly accessible URL for your webhook handler, and you can go and drop that into the Stripe dashboard, and that's going to give you back a webhook signing secret, and each webhook endpoint is going to have its own webhook signing secret. You might be wondering how to test out your integration. Well, over in the documentation for accepting a payment, you can drill down into the test integration section, and for each of the different payment method families between cards, wallets, bank redirects, etc., there are several different things that will allow you to test different scenarios. So for instance, we can grab this card, this test card that ends in 3155, and we can use that as one of our test cards inside of the payment element. And you'll notice that as we go through the payment flow here, this will trigger a secure customer authentication payment flow. So this is going to pop up a modal, and in production, this modal would contain a bank account, 2FA, or sort of like a one-time code or some way to verify that the customer is who they say they are and that they are allowed to authenticate this payment. So that's one way that you can test sort of 3D secure and secure customer authentication is with that special card number. Another thing worth noting is in the documentation, there are some optional steps depending on specific payment method types or QR code-based payment methods. These might require that you pass additional details when creating the payment intent, or they might have other considerations like with Apple Pay, you'll need to go into the dashboard and make sure that you have an Apple Pay domain set up and verified. So just to review the entire flow, the customer lands on the page, and we use any information from that page to create a payment intent using the API. And then when we return that payment intent's client secret to the client, we use that to build out a payment element on our custom form. That's where customers enter their billing details, and then we can submit that payment directly to Stripe client side. And then the customer is redirected to a return URL where we display this return status or this success status, completion status. And finally, we're handling fulfillment with our webhook. That's where we're actually pulling from inventory and printing shipping labels and doing all of those things that we might do when someone buys something from us. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.